Thank you very much. And thank you very much, Leslie, for that very interesting and important context. Critiques of anything to do with Black Lives Matter are often dismissed as a means of maintaining white privilege. So I just want to begin by establishing some of the assumptions that underlie this paper, some of which have already been or will be discussed by my fellow participants. One is that the goal of ensuring racial justice, exemplified by the slogan Black Lives Matter, is a mission worthy of support, and so is ensuring justice for Palestinians. Secondly, criticism of Israeli policy or action, when that criticism is rooted in fact, is not anti-Semitism. And thirdly, the nature of anti-Zionist activism today, as exemplified by the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS campaign, is both in effect and intent anti-Semitic in that it denies nationhood and a homeland to the Jews. It singles out Israel as a Jewish collective for defamation, holding it to standards that don't apply to any other country, and that it serves as a cover for anti-Semites to express classic anti-Semitism under the guise of criticizing Israel or supporting Palestinian rights. That given, two things became strikingly evident during the recent Hamas-Israel war. And the first is that anti-Zionism could be seen clearly as a manifestation of anti-Semitism. Beyond the singling out of the Jewish state for condemnation and the denial of self-defense for the Jewish people, we witnessed a wave of physical attacks and verbal abuse in the name of Palestinian rights and anti-Zionist protests. And these were directed at random, identifiable Jews, many of whom were non-Zionists. For example, Hasidim, who were targeted only because they looked Jewish. Slogans like Free Palestine and effing Jews were heard in tandem. And this type of hate rhetoric and these violent assaults in the name of Palestine targeted not only Israelis, but Jews and synagogues around the world. Now, the second thing that became readily apparent is the BLM movement's public alignment with anti-Zionist forces. On May 17th, at the peak of hostilities, when Hamas and terror groups under its auspices had already fired more than 3,000 rockets into Israel and managed to kill 11 people at that point, despite the Iron Dome missile defense system, a tweet was issued from the official Black Lives Matter Twitter account, and I'm going to share that with you now. It says that host disabled participant screen sharing. Is that, let me see if I can, is there a way to share my screen? Is there any way to share my screen?
Yes, there should be. Missy, could you make Ricki a co-host?
Might be useful if all the presenters were co-hosts. I don't know if the others will want to share things as well.
I just moved Ricki. The others are already co-hosts. She's now a co-host as well.
Okay, so let me share my screen then. Here. Okay, so it read, Black Lives Matter stands in solidarity with Palestinians. We are a movement committed to ending settler colonialism in all forms and will continue to advocate for Palestinian liberation. Always have and always will be, #FreePalestine. Now, neither of these two things were actually new revelations. Studies have documented the correlation between anti-Zionist expression, a prime example being the BDS campaign, and physical assaults, discrimination, and hate rhetoric directed at Jews, but not only at Jews, also at their houses of worship and their religious precepts. Nor was it surprising that the BLM movement publicly declared its solidarity with Palestinians using the type of jargon that's associated with eliminating the Jewish state, buzzwords like Palestinian liberation and settler colonialism. Patrisse Cullors, who co-founded Black Lives Matter and served as the movement's executive director during its rapid rise, has never made a secret of her vision for the movement. And I want to show you a clip from April 2015 at Cullors at a panel discussion hosted by Harvard Law School's Human Rights Program.
The other thing I'll say is Palestine is our generation South Africa. And if we don't step up boldly and courageously to end the imperialist project that's called Israel, we're doomed.
End the imperialist project that's called Israel. In other words, eliminate the Jewish state. Now, despite this early and clear call by Kalors, the issue of anti-Semitism in the movement was swept under the rug once the movement started gaining momentum following the killing of George Floyd last year. Indeed, the very notion of questioning anti-Semitism within BLM became a point of great controversy. Now, Patrisse Cullors has since stepped down as leader of the BLM Global Network Foundation amidst controversy over her handling of its finances and her own personal spending. But the two people who were named as interim senior executives, Makani Themba and Monifa Bandali, both share Cullors' hostility towards Zionism, and they, like Cullors, support BDS, and I will show you here. You can see in this tweet by Makani Themba, she calls on her followers to sanction Israel for defending itself. And in this Facebook post on the right, Monifa Bandali shares a BDS post labeling Israel an apartheid state. Now, Melina Abdullah, did I stop sharing the screen yet? Melina Abdullah is another leader of the BLM movement. She is co-director of Black Lives Matter Grassroots and the co-founder of the LA chapter of BLM. And she recently told the Washington Post that being in solidarity with the Palestinian people is something that's been part of our work at Black Lives Matter for almost as long as we've been an organization. So what does she mean by that? And how did anti-Zionism become incorporated into the BLM movement? So I'd like to take a look at the history of the movement and the development of its anti-Zionist ideology, as well as the role played by Jews in helping to incorporate this ideology into BLM's mission. And I also want to address the attempts by Jewish leaders and organizations to downplay expressions of anti-Semitism within the movement. So Black Lives Matter, or BLM, began as a social media hashtag in 2013 in response to the acquittal of George Zimmerman, a volunteer neighborhood watchman who had shot to death a Black teenager by the name of Trayvon Martin after a physical fight. The hashtag was conceived and promoted by three self-described radical Black activists, Patrisse Cullors, Alicia Garza, and Opal Tometi. Cullors was a protege of Eric Mann, who is a Jewish Marxist-Leninist organizer who was involved with such radical groups as the League of Revolutionary Struggle, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, known as SNCC, the Black Panthers, and the Weathermen, which later became known as the Weathermen Underground. And as a leader in the militant Weathermen group in the late 1960s, Mann was arrested and charged with conspiracy to murder and for promoting anarchy. He also promotes BDS and has called for an international ideological counteroffensive against Israel's colonial master narrative. He's accused Israel of barbarism and genocide, and he's called for creating a united front in the US rooted in Black and Latino communities to demand the complete and immediate cessation of all US military aid to Israel. As far back as 1970, Mann encouraged the targeting of Israeli embassies, tourist offices, airlines, and Zionist fundraising and social affairs for what he cryptically wrote, whatever action is decided to be appropriate. Now, it's important to remember that he wrote this in October of 1970 in The Guardian, immediately after the PFLP, Palestinian terrorist group, had attempted to attack an El Al plane and had hijacked several others. And he promotes and encourages this type of hate rhetoric and violent activism under the guise of virtue in the name of human rights as a self-respecting Jew and a Jew of conscience, as he describes himself. He attacks what he calls Israeli ideologues and thought police, who he claims tries to silence opponents and critics of Israel with charges of anti-Semitism. And in this way, Mann puts his Jewish imprimatur, his kosher endorsement, on violent anti-Zionism. Now, if Mann was Cullor's mentor for 10 years, as she says, it stands to reason that she absorbed not only his radical Marxist ideology, but his anti-Zionist ideology as well. Now, the BLM hashtag soon expanded to become a larger national organization, the Black Lives Matter Global Network, which was organized around the killings of Blacks during their encounters with police. The shooting death of Michael Brown by a police officer under contested circumstances in August 2014, and the subsequent decision by a grand jury not to indict that officer resulted in protests and unrest in the city of Ferguson, Missouri. And according to Cullors, it was this uprising in Ferguson that launched what she called the Black resistance movement under the banner Black Lives Matter. Now, earlier Black power groups like the Black Panthers and SNCC, as well as radical leaders like Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, Angela Davis, had already aligned themselves with Palestinians and were extreme anti-Zionists. Carmichael famously proclaimed that the only good Zionist is a dead Zionist. And the new Black Lives Matter movement was seen at that point similarly as a source from which anti-Zionists, BDS activists could gain support and allies. So Palestinian activists in the Middle East immediately tweeted out thousands of messages of solidarity with BLM protesters in Ferguson, linking their own cause with the shooting of African Americans by police officers in the US. In December 2014, Ahmad Abu Znaid, a Palestinian activist from Florida and the co-founder of a BLM-affiliated group called Green Defenders, recruited members of the emerging BLM movement to join a delegation to Palestine that would allow them to, quote, experience and see firsthand the occupation, ethnic cleansing, and brutality Israel has levied against Palestinians. Abu Znaid invoked the spirit of Malcolm X, Stokely Carmichael, and other Black anti-Zionist radicals, and called for reestablishing and fortifying the relationship with the new Black American leaders in the fight for liberation. Now, Cullors and other activists have pointed to this trip as the first step in creating public solidarity between the BLM movement and the BDS movement. And this trip was followed by similar ones designed to tie the two movements together. And it resulted in a 2015 Black solidarity statement with Palestine that vilified the Jewish state, falsely accusing it of ethnic cleansing, land theft, denial of Palestinian humanity and sovereignty, while calling on Black American institutions to join the BDS movement. And this is what Melina Abdullah was referring to when she declared that solidarity with the Palestinians was part of BLM's work since almost the beginning. Not long afterwards, in 2016, a policy platform was created by the Movement for Black Lives, an umbrella group that included the Black Lives Matter Global Network, led by Cullors, as well as smaller groups affiliated with BLM. The manifesto was called A Vision for Black Lives, and it included hostile charges against Israel, accusing the Jewish state of genocide and apartheid. And this extremist rhetoric was recognized as anti-Semitic and provoked widespread condemnation from almost all of the Jewish community and others who recognized the falsehoods and malice behind these charges. There was, however, one group that differed from other progressive Jewish groups who had condemned the inflammatory language while accepting other parts of the platform. And this group, which misleadingly calls itself Jewish Voice for Peace, JVP, endorsed the platform in its entirety, calling it inspiring. Now, of course, you know that JVP is made up of anti-Zionist ideologues who oppose the existence of a Jewish state and promote BDS. And they hastily assembled Jews of color, Sephardi, Mizrahi caucus with anti-Zionist credentials to accuse those who objected to the platform's anti-Zionist elements of being part of a white supremacist power structure. And I'll come back to that a bit later. I just want to point out that one of the two authors of the platform's contentious language was Rachel Gilmer of the Dream Defenders group that Abu Znaid had co-founded. Now, Gilmer is the daughter of an African-American father and a Jewish mother, and she was raised in her mother's Jewish faith. In her youth, she served on the board of the Zionist youth group, Young Judea, but she later became involved in anti-Zionist activism and anti-Jewish bigotry. And I just want to show you let me see if we can find this, a Facebook post. Let's see, here. This is a Facebook post about Zionism that she reposted on her Facebook page, whose anti-Semitic description of Zionism could have come straight from Nazi literature, with tropes of Jewish greed, immorality, money, and evil. Zionism is described as an engineered ideology by a group of very wealthy European Jewish men in order to protect their wealth from anti-Jewish sentiment in their home countries. Zionism is condemned as having entered the world to kidnap, pummel, rape, and suffocate history and reason, paving the way for the 20th century's greatest, most barbaric, and enduring heist. And the post ends, never estimate what the rich will do to protect and increase their fortunes. Now, Gilmer's social media and that of the Dream Defenders group that she now directs includes posts and tweets that focus at least as much, if not more, on demonizing Israel than in promoting any type of social justice for Blacks in the US. Now, the BLM movement at this point, this was 2016, was a chapter-based movement led by local organizers, many of whom, but by no means all, but many had signed on to that 2015 Solidarity with Palestine statement. The organizers didn't call themselves leaders. They made a point of portraying the movement as decentralized, without a hierarchical structure. But now let's fast forward to 2020 and the killing of George Floyd. The BLM Global Network reemerged as the leading force pushing for societal change, and Patrisse Cullors was publicly identified as the executive director of the movement. The widespread horror at the callous killing of Floyd and the desire to stand up for racial justice garnered unprecedented support for both the BLM message and the movement. And Cullors now appeared as the representative and face of the movement. Donations to Black-led advocacy groups skyrocketed, including over $1 billion in corporate giving. And the BLM Global Network Foundation, the fiscal arm of the movement run by Cullors, was a primary beneficiary of this windfall. And even though the foundation came under criticism for lack of transparency, donations continued to flow in. At the same time, BDS proponents were putting out statements blaming Israel for the death of George Floyd, alleging without basis that Israel had trained those responsible for killing Floyd, and implicating Israel for promoting structural racism in the US. It was a theme emphasized by Louis Farrakhan in his anti-Semitic tirades against Jews in Israel. Now, the notion of racist policing and border enforcement in the US being blamed on Israeli instruction was a device that had been used by BDS proponents and anti-Semitic agitators for more than a decade, but it was taken to a new level in 2017 by Jewish Voice for Peace. At that time, JVP started a campaign it called Deadly Exchange to smear Israeli police as promoters of racist policies in the US, through exchange programs with American police, the FBI, and ICE. The campaign falsely accuses Israelis of schooling Americans in extrajudicial killings, shoot-to-kill tactics, police murder, and attacking human rights defenders. And it uses anti-Semitic tropes of Jewish racism, power, and money, perverting non-Jews, as it accuses mainstream Jewish organizations in the U.S., the HAC, ADL, AIPAC, Birthright, JINSA, of being complicit in creating racist and deadly law enforcement. And now this is a very toxic and a frankly anti-Semitic campaign based on falsehoods, and it further promotes anti-Semitism in the U.S. Now, I do want to point out that Kalors and other leaders in the higher echelons of leadership did avoid publicly blaming Floyd's killing on Israel, even while many of their BDS allies were doing exactly that. Now, whether this was because they didn't want to divert attention from their immediate cause, or whether they feared a lessening of support and funding, or if there would be pushback against this sort of linkage, the fact is that they did temporarily tone down their blame Israel theme. On the other hand, other BLM organizers like Buki Domingos of an affiliated group in San Diego did join a BDS activist to co-author an op-ed promoting the deadly exchange libel. But more importantly, the theme of U.S. police being militarized by the Jewish state that had been publicized and promoted and continues to be publicized and promoted by JVP, this percolated within the movement as another point to cement a BDS-BLM partnership and animosity toward Jews. Now, the other theme that I mentioned earlier that JVP had promoted was the Jewish white supremacy theme. And this also was a popular theme among Farrakhan followers and Nation of Islam followers. And it had chilling consequences, which brings me back to Melina Abdullah, the leader of BLM's Los Angeles chapter. And I want to just share my last slide. Here, this is Melina Abdullah organized a protest riot last year in Fairfax, an Orthodox Jewish neighborhood and the oldest Jewish neighborhood in Los Angeles. And it took place on the night of May 30th, which happened to fall out on the Jewish holiday of Shavuot. And this is the tweet she posted just before the riot. She talks about uprising, rebellion, revolt. As you can see in the photos on the left, some of the area's synagogues were defaced with spray-painted obscenities and anti-Israel slogans. And businesses, including quite a few Jewish and kosher businesses, were vandalized and looted. Their windows were smashed. There were some reports that rioters hurled anti-Jewish epithets. There were no reported physical attacks on Jews. Many of them were at home celebrating the holiday. But the riot did provoke fear and apprehension among the neighborhood's Jewish business owners and residents. And the targeting of the Jewish neighborhood was no coincidence, as Abdullah explained in an interview on a local radio station. She said that the targeting of this particular neighborhood was deliberate in order to disrupt white affluence and make sure it's not just Black people who suffer at the hands of white supremacy. And her daughter, Tandiwe, who's a leader in the BLM Youth Vanguard, also said this in a different interview, agreed that the neighborhood was specifically targeted because it was a rich white area. So, like Farrakhan, the Melina Abdullah and her daughter view the Jewish community as a bastion of white supremacy, which is, as an aside, I just want to mention that Melina Abdullah is herself a descendant on her father's side of German Jews who fled Nazi Germany. Her Jewish grandfather, born Hans Steinecke, who went by the name of Gunther Reimann, was a well-known Marxist economist. Her father, John Reimann, is an anti-Israel socialist. And Melina herself is a supporter and associate of Louis Farrakhan. So I just want to mention that other synagogues in different cities, some not I don't know how many, were also defaced during subsequent BLM protests, and BLM signs and slogans were seen and heard at anti-Zionist rallies like Day of Rage protests last July, where anti-Semitic tropes were peddled. And through all of this, many Jewish organizations downplayed the anti-Semitism, this sort of anti-Semitism in the BLM movement. Regarding the Fairfax riot, for example, the ADL basted those who compared the riot to a pogrom, as some journalists and residents did. And while this may have been an overstatement, the ADL went on the offensive, calling that comparison an offensive comparison, and they insisted that claims of anti-Semitic violence were exaggerated, that Jewish shops were not specifically targeted. Regarding the BLM sloganeering at anti-Semitic rallies, they argued that BLM had not organized these rallies, and in the case of a San Diego chapter that did publicly endorse the rally, they argued that, the ADL argued that this chapter was not affiliated with the official Black Lives Matter organization. And while these things may have been true, but it was an attempt to downplay the expressions of anti-Semitism within the movement. And this was repeated in a full-page advertisement published last August in the New York Times, which endorsed not only the Black Lives Matter message, but the movement, which was called the Current Day Civil Rights Movement and the Best Chance at Equity and Justice. And this ad was spearheaded by radical groups like Jewish Voice for Peace, but it claimed to represent Jewish organizations from across the spectrum, speaking in one voice, and it attacked those who disagreed as pointing fingers, scapegoating, and using anti-Semitic dog whistles in order to undermine Black-led movements. So the tactic was to shame those with reservations about anti-Semitism in the BLM movement as racists and supremacists, and the tactic did actually work. The ad listed names of hundreds of Jewish synagogues and organizations, including the ADL. And needless to say, it provoked much controversy. So I just want to conclude with 2 points. The first is, were it not for radical Jews giving their kosher endorsement or even promoting anti-Semitic tropes and BDS activism, and Jewish organizations downplaying and minimizing expressions of anti-Semitism instead of reputing them, Black Lives Matter leaders would not be able to, or at least would have a much harder time incorporating this sort of anti-Zionism into their mission. And secondly, we can't afford to fear a mob mentality that creates its own interpretation of morality and justice, and that slanders those who differ. Anybody who strives for racial and social justice in the US must expose and uproot the anti-Jewish racism and the anti-Semitism that underpins anti-Zionist ideology, no matter where it's found. And with that, I'll end. Thanks.